Hi, Stuart here. Today another handy NuGet library. You can find the source code for it on GitHub and you can put it into your own .NET projects from NuGet.org. Okay, first things first. We need to get Docker up and going, and we're going to start a SQL Server instance running in Docker, connect to it from our tests, and use the tests to show you how the library works. So the first thing we're going to do is run a PowerShell script that you can get from the GitHub that's going to fire up SQL Server, load in the Northwind schema and all of its data into the SQL Server, and then spit out the connection string that we would use if we were going to experiment with it some more. So let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to run SQL start. And I'll show you that script in a minute. It's going to go and pull. I'm using SQL Server 2019 latest. You could use any stable version of SQL Server. The Northwind sample database provided by Microsoft works backwards to almost the earliest versions of SQL Server. But in this case, we're firing up SQL Server and configuring its instance name, its username, and the SA password. And then we're going to wait for it to start and load the schema, which it just did. And then it's going to kick out the connection string that we need to use to connect to it and wait. And now if we go and we look in our running Docker container, you can see that SQL Docker is up and running, and it's on the expected SQL Server port mapped to your local machine. By the way, if you're running SQL Server locally, you're going to want to change that port and change the script and change the test data configuration so that it's pointing at a port that you can use. Let me show you the SQL Server schema, which is this InstaWind database. This is, again, the Northwind database, and this is a script that's provided by Microsoft that allows you to fire up a schema and all of the data. You can see that it does inserts on a bunch of data so that you've got a useful test database. By the way, you don't have to use Northwind. There's lots of other good sample schemas, and you can get them all out of the Microsoft GitHub. And this is an old example that I keep updating that I'm going to be using to demonstrate the library. A couple words about the PowerShell. This is a pretty functional, bare bones sort of a PowerShell. It is by no means an example of the best practices, but it does show you some nice ways to get stuff up and going, including how to completely ignore the output. One of the things that I like to do is start with a clean slate. And so one of the things it does is that if I had previously run this Docker container, it will tabula rasa it from Docker and pull a fresh image. So we're always starting from a known starting point. And you can see that we are firing up Docker and supplying the appropriate data, including a volume mapping to where the script is and so on. And then we are causing it to run the SQL command that is going to load up our Northwind database script, and then we'll kick out the connection string as you saw. So there's some interesting things to learn in here. It assumes best outcome, so a happy path outcome, but it is a great way to get a Docker container up and going with the SQL script of your choice so you can use it. The library we're going to demonstrate is the ADO SQL Helper for .NET 6. And here are the tests. You can see that this is where the connection string and password and things are. So if you change this from something other than Northwind and other than in Docker on the default port, you'll have to change that. But then all of the tests will run across that. And for each of the exposed functionality, we have at least one unit test. And I'm using the community edition of Visual Studio, and so I have loaded the fine code coverage add-on because the built-in code coverage for Visual Studio is only in the enterprise SKU, but the fine code coverage will run on any version of the Visual Studio SKU. And in some ways, even though it's not tightly integrated into the test engine, I kind of like it better. So let me show you fine really quick. We'll go ahead and run all of the tests. In fact, although I'm using a unit test engine, MS test, these are technically integration tests because I'm calling out to a piece of infrastructure that isn't actually part of the test. And you can see that I've been pretty good about labeling things integration tests. And if we go to our fine code coverage window, you can see we have some pretty good coverage. And that's what I use for all of my open source projects. So here is some of the design goals for this library. The first is that all the methods are static and that absolutely everything that it would ever need is passed to it as an argument. And the advantage to that is that there is no constructor. There's nothing to set up. If you go to use a method, it's expected that you'll pass it the connection string and whatever the arguments are, and it will return the appropriate value. In this case, we're returning select count from the DBO products table. And in this case, we're going to get an integer piece of data back. And we're going to pass in the easiest possible thing to pass in, which is the database connection string, the SQL command we want to execute, and a parameters array. And in this case, the parameters array in this example is empty. We're not passing in any, we don't have any replaceable parameters. And it will invoke that against our SQL Server return. And then in this case, we're just going to assert that we got data back. In other parts of the library, for example, this particular one where we want to go get a data table of products, we're going to go get the top 3 products. Again, we're passing in empty params, a SQL connection string, and SQL Server, and the actual SQL statement. And you can see that we have a handy method called dump data table, which is a extension to text context. I'm big on extending text context, as you may have seen in my last video. And this pumps out a nice formatted table to the test output that I can go look at if I want. And then I'm just asserting that I have rows. Notice that the static SQL method has rows, allows you to then do an assert is true and confirm that we have rows. In this example, I'm executing a command and I'm not expecting a return. So in this case, because I'm not expecting a return, I'm going to get a -1 as a return. That's a SQL Server thing. So that just demonstrates we've covered that scenario. So we have a couple of things that clean up parameters. And one of the things that cleans up parameters is the ability to convert a set of text that is incorrectly formatted to a text that is correctly formatted. Again, I found that handy. I threw it into the SQL library. And then if this allows us to execute lots and lots of different ones. Here we have a bunch that test the SQL Server methods. We create a SQL parameter using Sql-Helpers parameter builder. For the life of me, I do not know why there is not an overload on SQL parameter that lets you specify the type, the size, and the value all in one swell foop. So parameter builder does that. It's the missing thing they left off the SQL parameter class. These are the most common things you want to supply for a SQL parameter, right? The SQL parameter name. Notice we include the @ sign, the type, the length, and the value. And then I add it to my parameters collection. To make sure that my parameters are clean, I'll call another method, clean parameters, that will do a bunch of things. If we have parameters that won't serialize correctly over the wire, for example, an apostrophe, it will clean those up. It'll escape those for you. It'll take out non-printing characters and so on. And then if we call SQL Helper execute stored procedure with data table, and yes, the method names are super long, but they're super obvious. So again, we wanted to make sure that this was the easiest library to use by making all of the arguments super obvious. So we have a connection string, we have the fully qualified name to our stored procedure, which I strongly recommend that you always fully qualify your name. Notice to use the square brackets, and we pass the parameters array, which in this case only has the single parameter in it. We get back the data table as a result. We dump it using dump data table, and we test to make sure that we got rows back. Here's another one that does the scalar test, this time with a stored procedure instead, and you can see it's very, very easy to use. And I encourage you to use ADO, particularly with stored procedures and the occasional view, because A, it is the single most performant way for C# to interact with SQL Server, bar none. It's infinitely easier to use than Dapper Entity Framework. I'm not saying those are bad ideas. I'm saying if I have a situation where performance is important and simplicity of interaction with SQL Server is important, and I don't want to have to keep track of my model in more than one place, I leave my model in SQL Server, I write stored procedures. Those stored procedures act as an API that uses the anti-corruption pattern. So as long as I keep the name of my stored procedure the same and the parameters the same and the behavior the same, I can change the underlying schema to my heart's content, and I can be backward compatible through my stored procedures, and I don't have to force my C# developers to do much. Notice there's very little ceremony or code here. There's no setup. There's static methods. You just use them and pass the right things to them. Thank you for your kind attention, and if you like this content, please do give us a thumbs up, and if you'd like, subscribe.